Sheriff's Office.
Hi, ma'am. This is Scott Sunford. Today at 324, 327, and 328, I had 3 census trips, and I've been out of town with family for a funeral. My wife was home.
Okay.
I just got home, and the board that I have over my back door has been broken. So somebody has forced their way in, and I haven't heard back from my wife. I need an officer here now.
Okay. And what's your wife's name?
Desiree Sunford.
On the morning of April 7th, 2013, at around 3:30 a.m., Scott Sunford made a frantic 911 call to report that his home alarm system had been triggered and he was unable to reach his wife, Desiree Sunford. Scott, who was attending a funeral out of town, grew increasingly concerned when repeated attempts to contact Desiree went unanswered. In the call, Scott's voice was filled with worry as he explained to the dispatcher that he feared something might be terribly wrong. He told the dispatcher that he had received an alert from their home security system, but initially dismissed it as a possible false alarm. However, as the minutes ticked by with no response from Desiree, his concern turned into dread. Scott provided the dispatcher with the address of their home in Yakima, Washington, and urged the police to check on his wife immediately. He explained that he was on his way back but was still a considerable distance away. The dispatcher assured Scott that officers would be dispatched to the residence immediately to investigate the situation. When law enforcement officers arrived at the Sunford residence, they found Scott already at the scene. He had driven back as quickly as possible and was standing outside the house, visibly shaken and holding a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. The officers instructed Scott to stay outside while they entered the home to assess the situation.
When I rolled up to the residence, I saw somebody had their spotlight on the house, and he had a pistol drawn. That person was later identified as Scott Sunford. And I asked him what was going on. Why didn't you go in? He said, I don't know what's in there. Which is a very odd answer to give.
Inside, the officers were met with a chilling sight. Desiree Sunford's body lay on the floor in the living room, surrounded by a pool of blood. She had been shot multiple times with a 9mm handgun, with the number of shots suggesting a deliberate and violent attack. The sheer brutality of the crime was evident. Desiree had been shot at close range, and the pattern of bloodstains indicated that she had attempted to crawl away from her attacker, desperately trying to escape. The officers carefully examined the scene, noting the disarray in the room. Furniture had been overturned, and several items were scattered across the floor, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place before Desiree was ultimately killed. The shell casings from the gun were found near her body, and a bloody boot print was left behind by the killer, providing crucial forensic evidence. The discovery of Desiree's body was a devastating blow to her family, friends, and the Yakima community. She was well known and loved by many, and the news of her murder spread quickly, leaving those who knew her in shock and disbelief. The initial focus of the investigation naturally fell on Scott Sunford. As Desiree's husband, he was the closest person to her and had a potential motive, especially after it was revealed that he had been having an affair with Paige Blades, a former Army colleague. The revelation of Scott's infidelity cast a shadow over him, and the police had to consider the possibility that the affair could have played a role in Desiree's death.
At that point, when I had exited the house and walked over to Mr. Sunford and told him that there was a deceased woman in the house. We believe it's your wife. I remember telling him, I'm terribly sorry. I'm terribly sorry. He had a stone cold look on his face. It seemed like it meant nothing to him. And I told the detectives when they arrived on scene, I think this guy knows something about this. Either he did it, or he knew who did.
Scott initially claimed that his relationship with Paige was strictly platonic, but during the course of the investigation, it was discovered that they had been involved romantically for some time. Scott eventually admitted to the affair, but insisted that it had nothing to do with Desiree's murder. He also stated that Desiree was aware of the affair and that their marriage was in an open relationship, though there were conflicting reports about the true nature of their arrangement. Paige Blades was also questioned extensively by the police. She confirmed the affair and provided an alibi for Scott, stating that he had been with her at the time of the murder. However, the police were not satisfied with this information alone and continued to probe deeper, looking for any inconsistencies or additional details that might point to a conspiracy between Scott and Paige. During the investigation, it was revealed that the Sunford residence had been burglarized just days before the murder. This raised the possibility that the two incidents were connected, especially since the burglars had stolen valuable items, prompting Scott and Desiree to install a new security system. The police considered the possibility that the burglary might have been a precursor to the murder, or that the same individuals were involved in both crimes. Despite the suspicions surrounding Scott and Paige, the police were unable to find any direct evidence linking them to the murder. Both Scott's alibi and Paige's statements held up under scrutiny, and there were no indications that either of them had been present at the scene of the crime when Desiree was killed. For more than a year, the investigation into Desiree Sunford's murder stalled. The police had few leads to follow, and despite their best efforts, they were unable to identify a suspect. The case grew colder with each passing month, leaving Desiree's family and friends in a state of deep anguish. The lack of progress was frustrating not only for the family, but also for the detectives who were committed to finding justice for Desiree. During this time, Scott Sunford continued to live under a cloud of suspicion. Although he had been cleared as a direct suspect, the affair with Paige and the peculiar circumstances of Desiree's death kept him in the public eye. Many in the community speculated that there was more to the story than what was publicly known, and whispers of a possible cover-up or involvement by others persisted. Meanwhile, Paige Blades also tried to move on with her life, though the shadow of the investigation followed her as well. The revelation of the affair had damaged her reputation, and she faced scrutiny from both the authorities and the public. Despite this, she maintained her innocence and insisted that she had no knowledge or involvement in the murder. In July 2014, the case took a significant turn when the police received an anonymous tip pointing to a man named Marty Grismer. Grismer was a co-worker and friend of Paige Blades, and the tip indicated that he had confessed to the murder of Desiree Sunford. The tipster, who was later revealed to be Paige herself, claimed that Grismer had admitted to killing Desiree in a twisted attempt to help Paige and Scott be together. According to Paige, Grismer had developed an obsession with her and believed that eliminating Desiree would allow her and Scott to have a fresh start. Paige had mentioned to Grismer that she was pregnant with Scott's child, though this later turned out to be false. The father was another ex-boyfriend of Paige's.
Marty was my best friend for a long time.
Believing that he was acting out of loyalty to Paige, Grismer allegedly decided to take matters into his own hands. With this new lead, the police quickly focused their investigation on Grismer. They conducted searches of his home and workplace, where they discovered critical evidence linking him to the crime. Gun parts found at Grismer's workplace matched the 9mm handgun used in the murder, and the bloody boot print found at the scene was consistent with a pair of boots owned by Grismer. Additionally, items stolen during the earlier burglary at the Sunford residence were found in Grismer's possession, further implicating him in both the burglary and the murder. Faced with this mounting evidence, Grismer was arrested and charged with second-degree murder.
Where it gets even worse for you is this gun barrel that we've been talking about. That's the gun barrel that was in the gun that killed Desiree Sunford. I've already retrieved that gun barrel from Basic American Foods, and I've already had the ballistic analysis done on it. And the slugs that were pulled from Desiree's body came from that gun.
Marty Grismer's trial began in early 2015, drawing widespread attention from the media and the public. The prosecution presented a strong case, supported by forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and Grismer's own confession. The evidence painted a clear picture of Grismer as the sole perpetrator of the crime, driven by his misguided loyalty to Paige Blades. During the trial, Grismer chose to enter an Alford plea, a type of guilty plea in which the defendant does not admit to the crime, but acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to secure a conviction. By doing so, Grismer was able to avoid a first-degree murder charge, which could have resulted in a much harsher sentence. As a result of the plea, Grismer was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While this provided some measure of justice for Desiree's family, many questions remained unanswered. The possibility that others may have been involved in the planning or execution of the crime continued to linger, leaving a sense of unfinished business for those who were close to Desiree. Even with Grismer's conviction, Desiree's mother, Connie, and others close to her continued to harbor doubts about the full story behind the murder. Connie, in particular, has voiced her belief that Scott and Paige may have had some involvement, or at least prior knowledge of the crime. She questioned how Grismer could have known that Desiree would be alone that night, and speculated that someone must have provided him with that information. Despite these lingering doubts, no further charges have been brought against Scott Sunford or Paige Blades. Both have since withdrawn from the public eye, with Scott reportedly living a quiet life in Washington, and Paige also keeping a low profile. The case remains a tragic and haunting chapter in the lives of those who knew and loved Desiree Sunford.
My heart will never be whole again. The only thing I can do for her now is to make sure that everyone hears her story.